Greetings, Acoustic Pants here, and yesterday on Reddit, in the Christianity subreddit, a user by the name of KungfuSimon, KungfuSimon, that makes more sense, made a post titled, "Why is biblical prophecy so confusing?" He's got a bunch of questions in there, so KungfuSimon, I wanted to make a video to answer your questions, and I've already posted to tell you I'm going to do this, but I'm going to post this video as soon as I'm done here, and I'm going to answer your questions in detail, because they're good questions, and they deserve good answers, and I can't just give you a one line, or even a wall of text, really, in Reddit to make it worth your while. So, this first video will be on your first question, which is... You had 5 questions, but the first one was, how did the dead saints' bodies rise in Jerusalem while they were supposed to be in the Spirit? Actually, I'll read the start of the question just so it makes sense, because you don't actually reference the event. I assume you're talking about a particular event in the book of Matthew in the Gospels, but your post starts off with, why is biblical prophecy so confusing? And that's what showed up in my feed. And then your first line of the body text is, biblical prophecy seems to be all over the place, and I can't figure out which is which. So, and that's pretty understandable, to be honest. It is confusing. The Bible's full of forms of literature which don't exist today, so they don't make sense to us. But this first question, how did the saints' bodies rise while they were supposed to be in the Spirit? So correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're talking about the crucifixion story where right after Jesus dies on the cross, all these things happen in Matthew 27, then I'll answer it from that point of view. So the bit you're talking about starts at verse 50, chapter 27, verse 50. Jesus has just died, and it says, "Then Jesus shouted out again, and he released his spirit. At that moment, the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and rocks split apart. Tombs opened. The bodies of many godly men and women who had died were raised from the dead. They left the cemetery after Jesus' resurrection, went into the holy city of Jerusalem, and appeared to many people. The Roman officer and the other soldiers at the crucifixion were terrified by the earthquake and all that happened. They said, 'This man truly was the Son of God.'" And so on. I could even really read the whole account to put that into perspective, but I won't. But Matthew 27 is the chapter that's from. So, if that's the part you're referring to, there aren't many other points. I don't think there are any points in the Bible where people are raised from the dead in Jerusalem. Not in plural like that you're referring to. So, in regards to your bigger question, like why is prophecy so confusing? It's important to understand in the Bible there's lots of different genres, and prophecy, or what you might call prophetic literature, is a genre of its own type, which needs to be understood its own way. And you also want to understand that in every book in the Bible, there's 66 books in the Protestant canon, a lot of books have more than one genre in them as well. They'll just switch from like a poetry to instruction to prophecy to narrative to something, they just change, and it doesn't tell you that it's changing. Nowadays, a lot of Bibles in modern translations will change the formatting of words on the page, but for a long time that wasn't the case. And in the original manuscripts, they didn't have punctuation, they didn't really do formatting. Writing was expensive, so you just kind of write a huge wall of text there's no capital letters, and there's no full stops or spaces, you just write. So you've got to, when reading the Bible, you want to try and spot what genre you've got, and if it changes halfway through, you want to spot that as well, because parts of the Gospels will change from narrative to a sermon, to a prayer, some things are songs in the New Testament as well, and then sometimes it'll be a prophecy. So, but this question here, you're not really talking about a prophecy or a piece of prophetic literature. You're just asking, how did the dead bodies rise? And that's a pretty good question. It's also worth noting that biblical prophecy is different to what you might think of when you think of the word prophecy. So biblical prophecy isn't always about foretelling the future. It's normally more about giving insight into present circumstances. Like, well, you could take the Old Testament prophets as example, where they're talking about current events, and they usually involve telling Israel, or the people of God, they usually involve the prophet telling Israel the situation they're in isn't going good places, so change your direction. It's a rough format to follow. But to this issue here in Matthew, I'll come back to prophecy later, a smart thing to do with the Gospels are just 4 accounts of Jesus' life, so if you read them horizontally. So you take one event in Matthew and you read the same event in the other Gospels, and you'll find that this event, when Jesus dies, and the Jesus dies in all of them, but the part where people are resurrected from the dead, that only appears in Matthew. It doesn't happen in the other 3. And there's lots of little events throughout the 4 Gospels where it'll be told a certain way in one Gospel and different in the others, or it'll appear in one but not in the others. And it's like that here. So why is there the difference then? If they're in Matthew, if this resurrection happens in Matthew, why not the other 3? Well, to explain that, I'd first have to explain the Jewish expectation of resurrection, Armageddon, the end of the world, the Messiah, and God's way of doing judgment. It's important to understand that the Bible was written by Jews, which sounds like a fairly silly, straightforward statement, but their views of God are sometimes even different to what Christians today have. And all the early Christians, they were all Jews as well. And the authors of the New Testament were almost all Jews as well. So if you want to get the Bible, you need to understand Jewishness, and you need to understand Judaism. So Jews don't have heaven or hell, right? Or maybe some forms do nowadays. But in Jesus' day, and certainly for a lot of Orthodox Jews today, there's no heaven or hell. They're waiting on their Messiah to arrive to free God's people, and they're waiting for God to set everything right. And at that point, on God's judgment day, God will resurrect everyone from the dead. So not just Jews, but everybody, or not just Christians, but everyone. Then the judgment happens, and the people who chose God's way get to go with him then, and people who reject God don't get to. But there's no articulation of what happens after that, right? So like, they don't have a heaven for the godly people to go to, and they don't have a hell for the ungodly people to go to. Ideas of heaven and hell are largely derived from Greek religions. Excuse me. So anything to do with resurrection should always be understood, or should almost always be understood, in terms of this Jewish expectation of Armageddon and no one coming back from the dead until the end of the world. That's the big thing, right? Resurrection is what happens when the Messiah comes and God finishes this age of history to start the next one, where everything will be right and we'll be free of sin and evil, brokenness and all the rest. So Matthew, as opposed to the other Gospels, is thought to be aimed at a more Jewish audience as opposed to the others. The author of Matthew is not only trying to say that Jesus is, the Son of God, or that he's a saviour, has authority over death, sickness, pain, evil spirits, and so on. The author of Matthew is really trying to say that Jesus is this Messiah prophesied in the Old Testament. So, for example, you've got the genealogies at the start of Matthew in chapter 1. The genealogy, it's not there to record his family line. I mean, if people wanted to, they could find it out themselves. The family line goes from Joseph, who isn't actually his father, by the way. It goes through Joseph, back through Solomon, King David, Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham, who is the father of the Jews. And it goes in 3 stages of 14 generations each. It's funny if you count them, though, it comes to 40 people. But this this genealogy and lots of other things in the book of Matthew, which I won't go into now, are trying to say that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah and that he is the one we've been waiting for. And so this resurrection of the dead is a sign that the author includes to say that, hey, no, this is the guy who's bringing about Armageddon, and this guy is the Messiah, and he's the one that signals the beginning of Armageddon and God's judgment day. Whether or not it actually happened, you could debate that or believe it or reject it. That's up to you. I don't think that's the author's point, and a lot of commentators, have a lot of commentary on this particular event. But the important thing with this question that you've asked and the other questions, KungfuSimon, is that it's a great name, by the way, far out. The important thing to get at is what you call authorial intent. What the author intended when writing. And in this case, most commentators and scholars believe that the author of Matthew is really just trying to hit home the idea that Jesus is the Messiah God sent. He's the one. And that's harder to do because Jesus wasn't a political or military saviour. He's a spiritual saviour from our sin and from death and so on. Whereas the Jews had a form of nationalism, many Jews had a form of nationalism, which they kind of applied to their view of the Messiah, and they thought the Messiah would kick out the Roman government at the time of Jesus. And they were expecting Jesus to one day just pull out a sword and start killing Romans, like killing them in just outright war, which they didn't get. As to how they rose from the dead when they were supposed to be in the Spirit, that's a bit of a different issue to why that's in the Bible in the first place. The question of how, like the metaphysical, biological, mechanics of spirituality, how, I honestly have no idea. Maybe God just did it. Somehow, with his magic powers, I don't know. God only knows how. I know a lot of scholars debate whether this is an historical part of the story, like whether it's something that actually happened, or whether it's something the author just included to make his point as to who Jesus was. I mean, I believe in miracles myself, but the fact this one isn't in the Gospel of Mark or Luke or John does throw a lot of doubt on the historicity of the event for a lot of people. And then you also raise the idea of how can someone be resurrected from the dead when they're supposed to be in the Spirit? And there's a lot of things you could mean by that, supposed to be in the Spirit. I don't really know much about your background to be sure of what you're getting at here. I guess, can the dead rise while their bodies are supposed to be in the Spirit? I don't really know. So with Jesus' resurrection, should he have been able to be risen from the dead? Or Lazarus, or the little girl that Jesus resurrected? You don't know, and I'd like to know more about what you mean and what your understanding of death and the afterlife is. The Jews had the place of the dead, but it wasn't like a place of consciousness. You'll notice in the Bible often when it talks about the grave or the place of the dead, it'll have the Jewish word Sheol, which is literally just the grave. And that's different to Greek ideas of Hades, the underworld, or Tartarus, which was underneath the underworld where people really suffered. There was people who were dead were just dead until the end of the world came, until God brought about his Armageddon through his Messiah. So maybe your question comes to that, I'm not really sure. Sorry I can't help you more there. Your next question, which was, let me read it out. John was supposedly in the future at Patmos Island. So you'd be talking about John the apocalyptist in the book of Revelation. He saw the dragon corrupting a third of the angels supposedly in the past, and then comes to earth again. So I'll deal with that question in the next video.
Ready for dust off.
And bye for now.
You want a piece of me, boy? Let's have a blast!
Upgrade complete.
Gotcha. It's about to get heavy. Yep.
Mineral field
We could use
depleted.
some help here. Armed and ready.
So, this first video will be on your first question, which is, you had 5 questions, but the first one was, how did the dead saints' bodies rise in Jerusalem while they were supposed to be in the Spirit? Actually, I'll read the start of the question just so it makes sense, because you don't actually reference the event. I assume you're... Greetings, Acoustic Pants here, and yesterday on Reddit, in the Christianity subreddit, a user by the name of KungfuSimon, KungfuSimon, that makes more sense, made a post titled, "Why is biblical prophecy so confusing?" He's got a bunch of questions in there talking about a particular event in the book of Matthew in the Gospels. But your post starts off with, "Why is biblical prophecy so confusing?" And that's what showed up in my feed. And then your first line of the body text is, "Biblical prophecy seems to be all over the place, and I can't figure out which is which." So, and that's pretty understandable, to be honest. It is. So, KungfuSimon, I wanted to make a video to answer your questions, and I've already posted to tell you I'm going to do this, but I'm going to post this video as soon as I'm done here, and I'm going to answer your questions in detail, because they're good questions, and they deserve good answers, and I can't just give you a one line, or even a wall of text, really, in Reddit to make it worth your while. So confusing. The Bible's full of forms of literature which don't exist today, so they don't make sense to us. But this first question, how did the saints' bodies rise while they were supposed to be in the Spirit? So correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're talking about the crucifixion story where right after Jesus dies on the cross, all these things happen,